studies and see what kind of new ideas people have come up with and so on. And they also published a book called The Five Gospels, or it was also called the Red Letter Gospel or whatever. And the idea of it was that it was their publication of all of the four, the Synopticon and the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas, which is considered to be an Gnostic gospel. But the argument he makes in here is that Jesus was a follower of John the Baptist. Remember John the Baptist, St. John the Baptist, was the one that famously baptizes Jesus in the River Galilee, right? And did I say that right? It's not the Sea of Galilee. What's the river? Jordan River. Thank you. I'm getting old, so my mind doesn't remember everything exactly right. But in any case, John the Baptist kind of was baptizing people there, and Jesus arrived, and there's a famous exchange between them was as John the Baptist, who was literally his cousin, I think, because remember Mary's cousin was the one that gave birth to him, and he was in her womb at the same time that Jesus was in Mary's womb, and when they met, with etc. There's all kinds of things between them. But in any case, John says to Jesus, "You should be baptizing me," and Jesus said, "No, whatever, I forget." And so he was baptized by John. Well, Robert Funk argues that Jesus was actually a follower of John the Baptist, and John the Baptist had all the traditional garb associated with the Cynics. He was a lot like Diogenes, basically rough, clothing, just a staff, that kind of thing, begging from people for food and so on, or how that normally would work. And then goes on to argue that so Jesus would actually, as a follower of a Cynic, was a Cynic himself. So in that sense, philosophically, Jesus was a follower of Socrates. Interesting. I'm not suggesting you should think that's correct, but there you go. That's have a look. Kind of an interesting approach to it. And here's the other book that the seminar did, and they voted on whether or not they believe Jesus actually said this or not. And so they had 4 different colors where they indicate whether he, if it's red, everyone agrees Jesus said this. If it's kind of gray, they're not so sure. If it's blue, and if it's green, kind of gets further. They're almost convinced that there's no way Jesus could have said this, because that really could have only been said 50 years later or something. So it's kind of interesting group. So Diogenes, Cynic, he wants to live a flourishing life, but he wants as little stress in order to achieve that as possible. And so he has no attachment to the community, doesn't volunteer to be on the assembly or any of the different community groups and so on. Just basically living like a dog, in a way. So that's one answer. The second philosopher that I'd like to highlight is Epicurus. And notice he would have been a contemporary of Aristotle, I think. There's some overlap there. But Epicurus was a wealthy man in Athens, and he had kind of a Mar-a-Lago, or a big property where basically he had gardens, and so life in the garden, was his property, and he grew his own vegetables and things of that sort. And he wanted to live the best, most flourishing life, but he's kind of a logical step more towards community than the Stoics, or I'm sorry, the Cynics, because instead of having no connection and no responsibilities and everything, he wanted to have everything. He wanted property. He wanted all the wonderful things about life and so on, but within limit. He didn't want to have too much of everything. That's kind of like Aristotle, right? You know, moderation in all things. By the way, there's a joke about the deaths of the philosophers. What was the reason that Aristotle died? Excessive moderation. Actually, Aristotle was, I think, 68, and apparently he drowned in the waves, looking for like one more sea creature that he could study. Maybe stepped in too far, or something. Who knows? However, Epicurus was wealthy. His students, were there on his property, studying with him in the garden. And he's got lots of writings, so you could look up Epicurus. In fact, I think on my notes, I gave you one of his pieces. There's several different pieces, but Seeking Happiness. So this is interesting because this is how to be happy, what things to think about, and so on. His advice, and when the Jesus Seminar puts together the different Gospels in that 5 Gospels, the book of Thomas, unlike the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which give not only the sayings that Jesus is reputed to have made, but also kind of a biography of Jesus' life. The sayings Gospel of Thomas just has sayings. There's no biological or biographical storyline. It's just Jesus said this, and Jesus, etc. So in other words, it's very similar to the kinds of writings that we see with Epicurus. But the things that are really famous about Epicurus are unfortunately not Epicurean. There's, for some reason, especially during the Roman period, at Nero especially, Epicurus's philosophy was taken to mean to have fun all the time, with no limits, basically. And as a result, Epicurean, we still hear about people that want to be Epicurean. Restaurants often are labeled as Epicurean delights, and so on. But usually when